Hello, I'm Richard Velleman, and I'm one of the originators of the five-step method. In this video, I'm going to basically introduce the research which led to the development of the stress, strain, information, coping support model, and then the five-step method that came from that. First, let me remind you about what the five-step method is. It's very simple. There are 5 steps. Step 1 is really helping the family member tell their story. And our job is to listen, reassure, and explore their concerns. Step 2 is identifying relevant and targeted information. Step 3 is exploring ways of coping and responding. Step 4 is exploring and enhancing support and communication. And step 5 is reviewing the previous steps and exploring any further needs. And to remind you that the five-step method has quite a lot of support from both family members and practitioners. Practitioners tell us that they like it because it's focused, because it's an excellent practical model which is helpful to them, and they like the skills-based training and assessment, and they find that it builds on their counselling skills which they've acquired already in their professional career. Affected family members like it because it helps them feel much less stressed. It helps them cope. It helps them develop their social network, which they find very valuable, and because the focus is on them and how they can improve their lives and their coping. And affected family members like the self-help handbook. One person, for example, said, I realized I may be able to make things better for myself. And both affected family members and practitioners alike like it that it's research-based and that it has a structured approach and it focuses on empowering affected family members. And if you click on this video that we have in the on the website, you can watch services talk about their experiences. Normally, when we're doing training, we would now have a small group exercise and we would help people who are training think about the impact on the family. And what we would do is we would divide a group into 3 and we'd get each one to discuss one relationship. So we'd say to the first group, imagine you're a family member. We want you to write down what the impact is on you and on the rest of the family of having a relative with an alcohol or a drug or a gambling problem if you were a partner. And the second group would say the same thing, but would say, do it if you were a parent. And then the third group would do the same thing, but say, do it if you were a child of someone with an alcohol or drug or gambling problem, or if they were one of your siblings. Okay, now obviously we're not going to do that now, but if you're doing this in a self-directed way or with a group of people, I would recommend that you do that now. That enables you to think through what the impact is for different family members on having a relative with a problem with alcohol, drugs, or gambling. Now, what we did was we basically talked to an awful lot of people. We used a mixture of quantitative and qualitative research, but the qualitative research, I suppose I'm going to focus on rather more here. And we did extremely detailed interviews on what it was like to be an affected family member. We found there was actually very little research on this. And so rather than going with lots of preconceived ideas about what it was like to be an affected family member, we thought we'd ask people. And we did research on parents, on spouses, on siblings, on adult children, on aunts, on grandparents, and so on and so forth. In England, for example, we recruited a group of 100 family members who all had a family member with serious alcohol or drug problems. Before that, we'd done another study with a group of 50 family members and so on. In Mexico, at around the same time, our Mexican colleagues and us recruited 107 family members of people with alcohol and drug misusers. In Australia, we went to Northern Territory in Australia and recruited members of the Aboriginal community there, both in urban and rural settings. We trained some people to be interviewers so they could interview other people in Aboriginal communities. And we altogether interviewed 48 family members of either rural or urban Indigenous Aboriginal inhabitants in Northern Territory. In Italy, we did the same work with 113 family members in different regions, in the north of Italy in Bologna, in the center of Italy in Rome, and in the south of Italy in Naples. In Goa, we recruited 150 family members and asked them very similar detailed questions. So a lot of research looking at people all over the world and asking them what it was like to live with someone with an alcohol or drug or gambling problem. And what we found surprised us, because people said extraordinarily similar things about what it's like to live with someone who has an addiction problem. And it seemed that they said almost exactly the same things, irrespective of where they came from. Obviously, there were small numbers of differences, but what I'm going to focus on here is the similarities. What they basically said was, it's very difficult to live with someone with an alcohol or drug or gambling problem. And as the family member who's affected by this other person's drinking, or drug taking, or gambling, the family members told us that their physical health was affected. They had lots of problems with sleeping, with eating, with headaches, had gastric problems and so on, and that they had lots of psychological problems. They experienced a great deal of worry, lots of anxiety, lots of people became very depressed. And they said it had a very big impact on their lives due to often violence, often aggression, even if there wasn't violence, and because of the uncertainty of living with someone who had a problem with any of these areas. They also told us that they coped in many different ways, or they tried to cope. Most people said that they weren't coping, but I'm not using coping as in the meaning of successful coping. I'm meaning coping in the meaning of, in the sense of what do you do about it? How do you respond to it? How do you try and live with it? And people told us that they did that in very many different ways. We wrote a paper about it a long time ago, 1992, talking about 15 or 16 different ways that people cope. But over the years, we've synthesized all these different ways of coping and realized that fundamentally there are 3 different ways of coping. And we used to use more technical terms, and a little bit later in a further slide, I'm going to mention some of those technical terms. But basically, in non-technical terms, the 3 ways are: some people put up with it, some people distance themselves from it, and some people stand up to it. Now, it's not that each person chooses one of those. Very often people use a mixture of all 3 of those different ways of coping, and very often people will use different ways of coping in different circumstances, even with the same relative. But nevertheless, those 3 ways, that thinking about it in those 3 ways, we found very helpful. And the other thing that we found from all of these interviews is that support is important. We found that if family members got support of the right type, and by that I mean, and this is going to sound odd, but it's support that they find supportive. Now, you may think that that's tautologous, but it's not, because some people receive support which the person who's offering it thinks is going to be supportive. And the issue is not the intention of the person who's giving the support. The issue is the person who's receiving it, and do they feel it's supportive? But if family members get support which they feel is supportive, then they find it's much easier to bear the problems resulting from living in this type of environment. So from all of these things, looking at all of the difficulties of living with somebody, the ways it makes the family member react, the ways that they deal with it, the issue of support, we developed a simple model, and it was developed directly from the things that family members have said. And this simple model here is the stress, strain, information, coping, support model. It's had different names before. We started off calling it a stress coping model, and then a stress coping health model. Then for a long time, it became a stress strain coping support, but we've realized how important information is, so we've added that in now. So now it's the stress strain information coping support model, 6 for short. And that basically says family members are stressed due to the impact of a relative's substance misuse or gambling. That leads to strain, and that strain shows itself in terms of physical or psychological symptoms or health problems. The amount of strain that any given amount of stress causes is influenced by 3 important factors: It's influenced by the amount of information that the affected family member has, because knowledge enables feelings of control. It's influenced by how they cope or they respond to the situation, and it's influenced by the level and quality of support available to the family member. So the stress, strain, information coping support model is evidence-based because it's based on all the research that we did, that we talked to so many family members, and that underpins the 5-step method. So in the 6 model, we see family members are both part of the solution. So if you want to work with someone with an alcohol or drug or gambling problem, we think it's imperative that you involve the family in that, because they are centrally involved anyway, whether you as a therapist like that or not. But also, we think family members have needs in their own right. We think that family members need to be at the heart of the response. So the 6 model doesn't go around blaming family members. We don't talk about codependency. We don't say that people develop problems because of their families. We don't have a view on that, but we think they are certainly part of the solution. But the 6 model describes the harms to individuals and families. And the issue for us was, how can these harms be reduced? And that led directly to the development of the 5-step method. And I don't want to go on too long about the 6 model, the stress, strain, information, coping support model, but it is vital that you understand that model, and it's vital that you can explain the model simply to affected family members, because it lies at the heart of what we're trying to do. And the model links to the competency framework and to every step, okay? So a reminder again, and you'll see how it links to the steps. Step 1 is the family member story, listen, reassure, and explore their concerns. And basically, we are trying to understand the stress and understand the strain that it leads to. Step 2 is about dealing with one of these major influencing factors. We identify relevant and targeted information, and we enable the family member to hear that, but also to try and discover more for themselves. We're trying to empower family members. It's not about us giving lots of information. It's about empowering family members so that they know where to get hold of information, so they can feel more informed and more in control. Step 3 is about exploring ways of coping and responding. We know that how people cope has an important bearing on the amount of strain that stress is going to cause them. And so we investigate that with the family member and help them work out the advantages and disadvantages of different ways of coping. Step 4 is about exploring and enhancing the support and communication. And step 5 is reviewing all of that, pulling it all together, and then exploring any further needs. So it's developed from the stress, strain, information, coping support model, and from what family members have told us that they need. I think it's important to underline the fact that not only is the 5-step method coming from the stress, strain, coping support model, and therefore, excuse me, and therefore is evidence-based, but we've also collected evidence about the impact of the 5-step method. So we know that family members typically show physical and psychological signs and symptoms, and these signs and symptoms are wide-ranging, and they include stress and depression and anxiety, as I've said. And what we know is, after receiving the 5-step method intervention, researchers found a significant decrease in both physical and psychological symptoms. And there's a copy of a paper here looking at and summarizing some of the evidence of gains for affected family members. All of these resources are on the website. We know that there are different styles of coping behavior. As I said, I was talking before about standing up to, putting up with, and distancing. The technical terms we used to use and still use sometimes are engaged coping, which is standing up to it, becoming engaged with it, tolerant coping, or putting up with it, and withdrawal coping, which is distancing yourself from it. And our researchers found a positive and significant change in people's own coping behavior, and also that often leads to changes in the behavior of the family member. We've also found, and the paper on the right looks at this in a bit more detail, links between coping and health. And we found that there's a strong relationship between high levels of tolerant coping and higher level of symptoms. Now, I don't want to suggest that this is necessarily causal, although it could be. It could be that tolerant coping puts people in positions where they actually become more anxious and more depressed and have more physical symptoms. But of course, it could be equally the opposite. It could be that people who are anxious and who are depressed and who are put in terribly difficult situations find the only way they can cope is to tolerate it. And it may be a third factor. It could be that the situation they're in is so difficult that that situation means that they can't cope in any other way because it's too dangerous for them to do that, maybe. And the situation they're in also leads to the anxiety and the physical problems they have. So I'm not suggesting any necessary causal link, and we need to do a lot more research to see what the causal links might be, or if there are any generalizable causal links. But the important point is that there is a relationship between tolerant coping in particular and lower levels of health. And we've also found that there's a lessening of the impact if you have the 5-step method intervention. By focusing on family members' own life and own needs, we found an increase in resilience amongst family members and an increased awareness of the effects on other people, for example, on children, other people in the family, and so on and so forth. We also developed the family member questionnaire, or the short questionnaire for family members affected by addiction, to give it its longer, more technical term. There is a video presentation on the FMQ, and you can get a lot more information in that video presentation. But it's evidence-based again. It was developed specifically for the 5-step method. What's very good about it is that it has two purposes. It's a therapeutic tool. It's used and is useful throughout the intervention. And clinicians and family members report that as a therapeutic tool, it's extremely helpful. But secondly, and helpfully, excuse me, it's also a research tool, so that we can continue to build the evidence base about the 5-step method, because we do it right at the beginning, and that therefore informs all the steps, and that's why it's used therapeutically throughout, to inform those steps. It's used right at the end, so that the family member can see how they've changed, but then also that gives us research evidence about how they have changed, and it's used in follow-up, 3 or 6 month follow-ups, depending on what organizations can manage. It has 33 quite simple, quite short questions covering the 5 areas that align to both the 5 steps and the stress strain information coping support model. And we find that it's very helpful to engage family members in using the family member questionnaire throughout all of our work with them. Just to give you a flavor of some of the results, this is the combined results from just under 400 before and after. So some FMQ done right at the beginning of step 1 or just before step 1 and almost at the end of step 5. And basically the red figures are what people showed beforehand, and the green figures are what they showed afterwards. On the right, it doesn't all add together. There's lots of reasons, psychometric reasons why we don't add all the scores together, but there are a number of scores we do add together, and we add them together and create something called total family burden. On the right, you can see that there's a very significant drop, and I should say that almost all the figures here are statistically significantly different. But on the right, you can see there's a significant drop in the amount of burden that family members show. And then all the way through, you can see differences in impact and different dimensions of impact, differences in symptoms and physical and psychological symptoms, differences in types of coping, where most of the types of coping reduce, but withdrawal or distance in coping increases, which is what, in a sense, we would expect after the 5-step method, and that different forms of support increase, helpful support increases, and unhelpful support decreases. So these are all the things that we're looking for, and these results show them. So where is the 5-step method working at the moment? Well, we've run about 130 or so courses. We've trained at least 1,700 people. And at the moment, we we've run courses in all these places, and people are delivering the 5-step method in Canada, in Ireland, where there's a national scheme, in England, in a number of different services across England, in Holland, where there's a national scheme, in Italy, in Hong Kong, in Australia, in New Zealand, where there's again a national scheme, in India, Nigeria, and Mexico. So it's being utilized in a lot of different countries, and we are consistently getting very positive reports from practitioners and through them from family members about how helpful it is. So let me just underline the key principles of the 5-step method. Firstly, it's different to other ways of working with families. It's empowering. It's encouraging of resilience, it's non-pathologizing. We don't blame family members, we don't tell them that they're codependent, that they have an illness, that they're enabling their user to behave in certain ways. We don't use language like that. It focuses on the family member as someone who has needs in their own right, and who, if they are stronger and more resilient, will also be able to deal better with the person in the family who's got the addiction, gambling, alcohol, drug problem. It's evidence-based and in two ways. Firstly, it's developed from the evidence. The stress, strain, information, coping support model is developed from the evidence. The 5-step method is developed from that evidence, and then it has evidence that it is effective. It provides a structure to guide work. It provides a structure for us as practitioners, and it provides a structure for family members. And both practitioners and family members really appreciate that structure. It's also very flexible. It's flexible in the number and frequency of meetings. Often, especially when we do research trials, we do 1 step per meeting, but that's not written in stone. Sometimes people spend longer on a step, and they may take more than 1 meeting to cover a step. Sometimes they may do 2 steps in 1 meeting if things go very fast. It is possible to do the whole of the 5-step method in 1 go, although we don't recommend that. But it is flexible, and so it depends on the needs of the family member that you're working with. So it's flexible in the number and frequency of meetings, in the number of family members. It doesn't only have to be done with 1 family member. We often have done it with parents, so with 2 family members, but equally you can do it with a group of family members. And in the length of the sessions, in general, they're about 40-45 minutes, but they can be longer, particularly steps 1 and sometimes step 3, or they can be shorter. We've done research to find out that it is applicable in a range of settings. So the research that we've done has included non-governmental organizations, voluntary organizations and charities, primary healthcare, secondary healthcare, specialist health services and settings and so on, addiction treatment units in private services, and we found it effective irrespective of the setting. It's flexible in terms of its mode of delivery. Obviously, it can be done, and we based it initially being done 1-to-1, but it's been used within self-help groups. It's been used in a group setting where I've mentioned having more than 1 family member from the same family, but also having a number of different family members from different families grouped together. And so people have run 5-step method groups in a number of settings and a number of countries. It's been done on the telephone. And of course, now increasingly, because of COVID, we have developed ways of doing it through Zoom as well, and other video conferencing methods. So it's extremely flexible in terms of how it gets delivered. But we do recommend that steps should be worked through in the order that they're written. And there are lots of reasons for that, which we'll go into in other videos. It's also the case that if you are thinking about doing it in a setting other than a 1-to-1, so if you're thinking about doing couple work with both parents or more members of the same family, or groups with more than 1 person, a number of people from different families collected together, you may want to consider some additional training. So that you feel more familiar working with couples, more familiar working with families, and more familiar working with groups. And then we've said all the way through, and we say on the website, that you can't become a 5-step method practitioner simply by listening to tapes, by watching videos, and by reading handbooks. So you do need training. However, it's important to underline that training on its own is not enough. The evidence was recently summarized by Drug and Alcohol Findings, and I've got a web address here for you if you want to look it up. And the headline from that evidence was that simply putting on training courses, in quotes, typically fails to sustainably or appreciably improve practice or outcomes, leading to the implementation gap between research-tested interventions, like the 5-step method, and real life. And that sending counsellors away on a course is often a waste without post-workshop feedback on their performance with clients, ideally allied with expert coaching. So the 5-step method has developed the competency framework and a method of expert feedback to make sure there is no implementation gap, no training dilution effect. There's much more on this later in another video called on competency and accreditation. But I want to underline how important it is that you don't simply get trained and go off and do it. The idea of getting feedback on your performance and having expert coaching is something which goes to the heart of what we try to do with our accreditation system, and it is really important. So I think it's important that you now review where we've got to. You need to think, can I explain the 5 steps? Can I explain the stress-strain information coping support model? Can I explain the research and the outcomes we have got from the research, both before leading up to the stress-strain information coping support model and afterwards evaluating the 5-step method? Can I explain why the 5-step method is different to other approaches? I think I would recommend that you look at a lot of the 5-step method website and the articles and other videos. So there we are. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.